He will give you the title of the proposal and what it's about in about a few seconds. I am the chair of the dissertation committee, and I do need to go over these components very quickly. Jordan had them on the slide, so hopefully everybody was able to read that. These are the rules of the dissertation proposal defense of the University of Maryland. So the first part is open to everybody. And the questions, which is going to be Jordan's presentation, followed by questions from the audience. I will moderate the discussion. After that, when we move to formal questioning, we will ask everybody who is not formally affiliated with the graduate school, essentially, at the University of Maryland. I don't know, are undergraduates allowed to stay for that part? But we don't have any undergraduates in the room, so it's irrelevant, but I don't know. So everybody who is not formally affiliated with the University of Maryland School of Graduate Studies, either being the student, graduate student, or faculty or external committee member who was approved by the University of Maryland, will have to leave the room, and the examination committee will be asking tough questions. Upon conclusion of the questioning, we're going to ask everybody else to leave the room so that the committee can proceed with deliberation, and one of the conclusions will be reached. That's something.
Recording and
Recording the whole thing. Okay. I don't know how many people we have on Zoom.
We have
Do we have students on Zoom? Our students on Zoom?
I don't see anyone I know, but there is other people that I know.
Okay, so other people will probably have to close the Zoom session for the formal examination part. Just so that everybody knows. If we had our grad students, they would be allowed to stay, but everybody who is external to the University of Maryland will have to leave. All right, without further ado, Jordan.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Okay, so thank you so much everyone for being here. Jordan Alexi, Caraballo-Vega, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I've been doing for the past 4 years in regards to modeling cloud-to-ground lightning and ignition, particularly in Alaska. Many of you all have seen frequency and intensity of wildfires has been predominantly for the past few decades. We have seen for the past 3 years smoke even from Canada fires here in Maryland. We have seen it in many other places. And this all kind of get exacerbated because of all the climate change conditions that we're kind of experiencing. Rising temperatures. We have carbon that actually gets out of some of the fires that are occurring. We have many of the biochemical processes that we're trying to understand still, but to this day, we just don't know yet exactly what's happening behind them. In addition to that, we have places like Alaska that are actually getting fires right now. As of right now, we have actually a few fires that are going on that have actually been going on for days in this fire season. And it's just because many of these alarming rising temperatures have just made all these conditions worse. We don't know exactly all the processes that are happening. There are many gaps in our knowledge. So Alaska is one of those locations where we can actually study them, because many of the fire suppression that we see in California, many of the effects that we have on some of the populations, some of the cities, we don't have to experience them in Alaska because of the vast amount of land that we have in. So it's a very suitable area to understand what are those fire dynamics, what is happening, and what are some of those drivers that are making it happen. Alaska in particular has been increasingly getting more of an area. We still have fire seasons that continue to surprise us. We have now satellites that allow us to identify those fires, but what is driving some of those fires, we still have gaps in our knowledge, and we need to understand what is happening there. 2022, Tundra, an area that has been fire prone for many years. We're now seeing a lot of fires there as well. So everything is burning right now. We need to understand why. We need to understand where those drivers are occurring. See, many of the days where we have been extreme burst of lightning that then kind of drives some of these fires. We get bursts of fires, but then people need to actually go and suppress them when needed. That requires resources. The government by itself has spent more than 20 million, only on the 2025 budget, trying to suppress some of these fires. Again, land, vast area, we don't have to suppress them all, but still there has to be a budget for it. Yet we still have a fire season that we're like, hey, like we haven't seen this before. We still don't understand why all of this is actually happening in this area. So that is the main motivation of this thesis. In addition to that, we have then conditions that are just really hard to get to. Even to try to suppress some of these fires, we need to rely on helicopters, we rely on airplanes, because just getting there is extremely challenging. We have the Dalton Highway, which is kind of the main road that they use to many of these locations, that is actually one of the most critical highways in the entire US and one of the most dangerous ones as well. So understanding this goes from both the science perspective, but then also trying to prevent and try to help maximize what fire agencies are doing in this area. So this is what leads to our overarching question. What meteorological and environmental conditions govern cloud-to-ground lightning, which is the main precursor of large fires in Alaska, and then fire ignitions across Alaska? Now, we do have two main biomes in there. We have the boreal biome, we will have the tundra biome, and we want to understand what is the difference between these two. This is then split into three different studies. The first one is understanding if we can actually predict cloud-to-ground lightning with the new resources that we have in terms of AI, compute, etc. Can we actually predict cloud-to-ground lightning and advance it state of the art? Second one is then explaining what are those drivers of cloud-to-ground lightning. Why are we able to model cloud-to-ground lightning and what is driving these conditions? The third one then is what are those meteorological environmental conditions that are then driving this ignition start? We have lightning, but then how can we forecast? How can we model ignition so we can understand some of those drivers? Okay. So if you don't listen to any of the things that I'm going to say in the next 30 minutes, these are the three key takeaways. Okay. First one, lightning is actually more predictable than we thought. Game changer for preparedness. And we're going to talk more about the details, but this is key as a starting point. Second one, lightning and ignition controls are actually strongly biome dependent. We need to understand those processes. We're going to dive deeper into some of these. And the third one then is more lightning does not necessarily actually drive all of these ignitions. But we're going to see that some additional surface processes need to be present for this to happen. Okay, so let's dive deeper into some of these. First research question. We understand that lightning is the main source of some of these ignitions and large fires in Alaska. But what governs some of these cloud-to-ground lightning strikes that happen in the ground, we still don't understand it. And how are they different between boreal and tundra? There's still some gaps. The literature, they have been on this for many years now. We have been studying lightning. We have been trying to even model lightning to understand and allow some of these agencies to prepare. We're still in the course side of things. We have two main resolutions that people have been targeting: spatial resolution, temporal resolution. On the spatial resolution side, we're still between the 5 kilometers to 30 kilometer range. Many of the ones that are on the 5 kilometer range, they're still very short time ranges. From some of the fire agencies that we have been kind of talking to, etc., and that have reported some of these online, what they're looking for is to have very high resolution, quality lightning strike and density forecast for their agencies to be able to prepare for it. But now, to understand the science, we also need longer terms, because that way we actually understand some of those drivers in long terms, and that would enable us to do more than seasonal forecasting. That would enable us to also see kind of future scenarios. So this is kind of where the gaps that we have identified are, and where this work actually starts with. So we're looking at modeling them and forecasting lightning in 5 kilometer resolution, so increasing the spatial resolution state of the art, but then also the temporal resolution, trying to forecast this 10 days in advance so we can understand what are these drivers various days in advance. Now, everyone that does machine learning knows that we need data. So input data start. We need to understand the methodology of what is happening. For these, we use the WAR, the Weather Research Forecasting Model, to have methodology for the data. As simple as it goes. We want data at 5 kilometers. So we don't save, so we save compute, we model the surroundings at 25 kilometers. And then each grid cell that is in the middle there, that 5-kilometer domain, each one of those grid cells is going to be 5 kilometers of meteorology data. We have methodology. Now we need to then start building our data set so we can actually model some of these conditions. For that, then, we start understanding if water is actually capable for this. Many people have been trying to use water in many locations across Konos, US. Using it in the Arctic, very challenging. So we needed to understand if these conditions were actually favorable for the use. Yes, we understand that this is actually useful for our data set. Now we can actually trust the methodology that we have. We can start working with the models. When we start building data, many of you know that machine learning is just lazy. If you give it something, it's going to output something. But we want to give it something that is of quality. We want to give it something that is representative. So for this, we propose the use of different windows across different severities of lightning. So a day that doesn't have any lightning at all versus a day that we have a lot of lightning. And then we have windows where we might have different conditions of water that we can then extrapolate across different fire seasons. Know that we want to do this across multiple fire seasons, across multiple years. So we need to have representative data that would actually show some of these windows. So on the right-hand side here, we have several colors. We have red, orange, blue. These are actually representing some of the conditions that we have in regards to different types of lighting. On the bottom of level, we did some clustering using the methodology data from water to get different representative samples. So we can have lighting in different scenarios that we can understand. Now, this is giving us kind of that initial set of data, but how do we actually validate this in a very fair and useful way? Well, we have two ways of validating this. The first one is using data from 2012 to 2022, stratified to get the best conditions that are representative for lighting across the board. The second scenario, which is more on kind of the pseudo-operational side of things, how good is this if we forecast multiple fire seasons? Do we actually retain skill across some of these fire seasons? And do we actually are able to model some of these cloud lightning processes that are occurring? I promise I was not going to spend too many seconds on this. So I'm going to be brief. This is a slide that I love. This is part of the machine learning that kind of allows us to explain some of this science. And the idea here is that many years we have been using thresholding mechanisms that most of the time just look at the data, make decisions based on the thresholds. Here we're combining the power of thresholding mechanisms like random forest, XGBoost, with the addition of neural networks to see the nonlinearity of ground lighting. As looking at the data, we understand there are nonlinear relationships here, and this is why lighting is hard. You actually see a lightning striking, and you don't know exactly where it falls. You actually see the light, but you don't know where it fell. So there are many nonlinear relationships that we need to understand here. So we create what is called an ensemble-based modeling framework, where we use the power of multiple of these architectures to then produce an output, a probability output of how likely it is a lightning strike to hit in this particular location, okay? Some of the results that we have, this on the left is one of the examples from the Weather Service. Red dots are basically lightning strikes that happen. This is a moderate to severe day. On the right side, you see some of the forecasting occurred. Higher probabilities are on the yellow to red range. You can see on top there, lightning strikes are actually occurring for those particular 10-day windows. This is another example window. This one is going from low to severe. We didn't have any lightning. Lightning exploded. Now we have a lot of lightning occurring in the area. Same forecasting on the right side of things. This one, I always bring it up as an example because I just love this day. This is one of those days that you're like, as a machine learning developer, you want to represent everything, but you don't know what is going to happen. 2023 had the highest day with lightning in Alaska, and the model was actually able to forecast and get the probabilities across the board. You can actually see that even with an anomalous event, the model is forecasting probabilities across the entirety of Alaska, but it's capturing pretty well the texture and location where this lightning strikes were going to occur. We don't model for this. We don't model for these anomalies, but the ensemble was actually able to capture some of those dynamics. When we go then and kind of quantify this, those are pretty pictures. We got to quantify how this is actually going. We actually see several metrics that we kind of are interested in. First one, area under the curve. We actually see that across the entirety of the 10 days of forecasting, we have an area under the curve of about 0.8. If we look at the frequencies and the probabilities of those forecasts, given that we're dealing with the probabilistic output, we want to make sure that we have probabilities across the board. So we actually have probabilities across days that are just not going to be any lightning, and days that are going to have higher probabilities for some of these lightning occurrences. Question one, findings here. So first of all, we are actually advancing state of the art. We have the framework now to model lightning to understand some of these drivers, and we actually are surpassing state of the art in terms of spatial resolution, temporal capacity, doing 10 days in advance, and then also having a higher scale in terms of those 10 days that are simulated. We're extending the predictability horizon for some of these lightning occurrences, and this is serving to answer question number 2, which we're going to then move on. These advances are going to actually enable many of the science that people are looking for in many of the areas, which is then driving us to research question number 2. We have the framework, we have the data. Now we actually got to see what are those drivers. We need to understand what is happening with those drivers. But why spending so much time modeling lightning? Well, 83% of the fires were caused by lightning strikes. We're talking about the large fires that are occurring in Alaska. We can actually see that they go from being on location that we have trees, on location that we have kind of non-trees, etc. And this is explained by the biomes of Alaska. This is what the boreal forest looks like. Lots of trees, lots of area. Now, this is how the tundra looks like. Much colder area. You don't have any trees. We have a lot of stratification examples just because of many of these fires, but still we have two very different landscapes. And want to understand how are these drivers different between these two. So what do we know? We understand that many of these thermodynamic relationships are very similar between the two areas, but we haven't quantified some of these drivers around. So the idea is that we're going to leverage this framework that we built in chapter 1, and then we're going to use it to explain some of these relationships and behaviors that are occurring between boreal and tundra Alaska. For this, we then use many ways. First one, model agnostic metrics. We're just looking at permutation importance, we're looking at relationships data, but then we're also using something that is called CHEP. And the idea of CHEP is we have a model. The model is giving me some predictions, but then I am actually looking at the feature importance of this and summing them up to understand how are these features moving the predictions one way or another. I want to look at lightning strikes. Well, how is this prediction or this variable moving my prediction if this is going to be lightning or not? If it goes to the left, if this variable increases in size, how is that going to affect my prediction, my probability outputs? And that is what we're looking for. We're looking for metrics that are model agnostic, but then we're also looking for metrics that we can understand through the framework that we just built. So looking at some numbers again, I'm going to focus particularly on two metrics that I'm very interested in here. Probability of detection, making sure we can actually forecast and predict and detect some of these lightning strikes, because this allows us to understand, okay, framework works, we can use it to inspect what is happening with the data. The second one is the Brier score. We're not outputting just ones and zeros. We're actually outputting a probability for other folks that can actually use further science research. They can calibrate their probabilities, they can use it in many ways. So understanding that Brier score being closer to 0 allows us to understand the probabilities actually match the targets that we have. So those are the main two metrics that we're kind of leveraging in here to just not only say, well, we had one day, this day had very little lightning. My model said that there was no lightning at all. Oh, 90% of accuracy. No. This is allowing us to understand more what is happening with the data, what is happening with the predictions that we have. For this specific component, instead of training a single model for Alaska, we train three different models. We have a model for Alaska, we have a model for the boreal, we have a model for the tundra. All of them with meaningful, skillful characteristics here, areas under the curve above 0.8, even across some of these 10 days that we're predicting. We then can use this and leverage this for the outputs and drivers of light. So understanding it from a model agnostic perspective, want to understand what is similar, what is different. If we look at some of the similarities here, we can see that there's some variables in here. For example, MK, rain C. MK being a convection index that gets calculated from water, from the methodology, which is saying, okay, is there going to be any convection energy in this area? Grain C is basically that precipitation with convection. Is there going to be precipitation with convection in this area? If so, these are being used in each one of the three versions of the framework. So we have this similarity between them. Now, there's something that is different here. When we go to the boreal, we do have variables that are more like on the energy side of things. It's like, do we have available energy for convection? On the tundra, on the other side, okay, well, Once we have initiation, once we can actually start lining convection for lightning strikes, that's when we actually have some of those drivers coming. So from the boreal, it's not so much about how it's going to start. We know it's going to start. There's just has to be a lot of energy there. For the tundra, it's harder to start, but then once it starts, that's where we actually have that convection. When we look at chat, particularly trying to understand, okay, how does this variable influence? Know that the color scheme here is you have higher values, lower values on this end. Where higher values means that as the value is higher, the probability of starting a lightning strike for that particular grid cell is going to be higher. So we can see that rain C and MK, very similar between boreal and tundra. Those are our convection indices. We need convection there. However, for the tundra, we have variables like total totals and leaf convection. Oh my God, that's I'm so sorry. I'm gonna look it up. Leaf convection is over the parasol. The idea is that we have temperature and we have convection in the same location to actually start and initiate convection here. So again, we're moving from just having the energy available to then having the energy plus the initiation for the tundra, which is very, very much different when we're modeling it too. Using this chap as well, we can actually have thresholds. So once these variables are outside of this threshold, they can actually initiate lightning. So we do have now the information useful to then understand as long as we are above this threshold, we are going to have lightning for this particular location. So we can actually define some of these thresholds and then understand how some of these conditions actually relate to the starting of lightning. So question 2 findings. First of all, we're able to quantify similar drivers that are between boreal and tundra, but we are also able to identify what are the differences between boreal and tundra. While they have similar drivers, they do have differences that are very important to identify because when we're modeling the fire, if we have some of those conditions across the board, then we can use them to understand where is lightning going to start. We also have then linking some of these drivers to the predictability of our model. If we have some of these conditions present, the likelihood of having lightning for that particular location, very high. It's going to start. So, as a summary for this particular chapter, lightning in Alaska is actually controlled by this non-linear bio-independent environmental conditions. And this is what's going to help us to better understand that depending on these conditions, we might have lightning. Once we have lightning, then we move on to ignition. We have lightning. Lightning doesn't actually tell me that there's going to be ignition. There could be a lightning and I saw it outside here, but didn't start a fire. Many conditions need to be happening for this to actually start. So what do we know? We know that we have emission sources that we actually take from many of the sensors and satellites that we have available. We also know that there's fuels involved. We also know that there is seasonality effects in place, there's temperature in place. But what are those specific gaps? Well, first of all, the predictability of ignitions. We have beautiful sensors that we can use to identify fires once they start. The predictability of ignition is a bit harder. How can we forecast the probability of ignition for some of these locations? Second is the coupled drivers. How do we have different interactions between the methodology of things and what is happening in the surface? Third one is then the biome dynamics. What is different? What is similar between some of these locations? And third of all is then how do we scale between the temporal side of things? How do we go from single hour forecasting to then having a multi-seasonal location? So for this, the way we're understanding some of these drivers is modeling then the probability of light. Each one of those grid cells is going to have a probability that that particular grid cell is going to start. There's going to be a fire starting in that particular location. And that's what we want to look at so we can understand some of the drivers. Data is everything. So for this, gather multiple data sets. But know that there's a lightning load variable in here, which we're taking from chapter 1 modeling framework. So we're using the probability of lightning from chapter 1. In addition to data that's from fuels data sets, from terrain data sets, information from ignitions in the past from years. We have information from all these variables that we're then leveraging into the same simulation modeling framework. In regards to the modeling side of things, again, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, even though this is fun. We have a lot of information in the data sets, but labels for fire are kind of scarce. Like if you don't use a highly like long period of time, having labels on when a ignition is going to start is not very prevalent, particularly even for us. So what do we have? We pre-train this transport-based model using data from the WARP methodology that we have, so we can at least learn some features first. We don't start from scratch. Learn some features. We have some of the information that we have in the methodology, so we don't need that much data just to start. Then we have a multi-layer perception on the other hand, which then is going to relate our active fires that we get from beers and all the variables that we have in methodology, the rain, everything else that is in there. So this is the way we model, so we can actually understand what is happening with this drive. What are the things that are driving this framework to understand and to predict the model by. Once we have this, we go through a grid search to find the best combination of features and variables, and then we define the model so we can then use it to do our predictions. For here, we basically use Monte Carlo approach to just look at all these variables, see how they influence this on the model, and then we'll move on from the modeling side of things. One thing that we saw from the science in the kind of fire community was that instead of wanting lightning probability, how probable it is for a lightning strike to happen here, they were mentioning density, how many lightning strikes we're going to have for each one of the grid cells. So we have to check, we have to prove what happened here. So there is a second model here happening that is then producing, instead of the probability of lightning for that one, is how many lightning strikes are going to actually happen in this particular grid cells. How many of them are going to happen? And then we use this to understand the influence of this in the modeling side of things. So this is just some examples of probabilities in the map. These probabilities are lower than 0.5. I'm just hiding them in here because, again, there are many fires in there. Probabilities that are higher than 0.5, then they get thumb up. I'm just showing a few examples of some of the fires and showing some of the kind of how this would look like from the modeling standpoint. Now, the outputs of the probabilities, these can actually be fed into other things. Like, for example, we're modeling later on fire spread, we're modeling later on other combinations from where these fires are going to start. From the quantitative side of things, we get some of the metrics again, looking at the Brier score in terms of the probability of lightning, looking at areas under the curve, particularly for the entirety of the framework in the model. But again, we're not just interested in modeling, we're trying to understand some of these drivers. So we start comparing. First of all, lightning probability versus lightning density. As we see, when we have the lightning density, we don't have any differences between if there is a fire going to start or not. However, when we start looking, particularly on the right, at the lightning probability, that actually helps us to differentiate very clearly if a fire is going to start or not for that particular observation. In addition to that, we look at MDA for understanding what are those features that are driving this model. What are the features that are going to allow me to explain some of these fire probabilities? Lightning probability also comes there in the highest place. We have elevation. Many of the elevation components are going to also help with convection. So they're kind of related to all this potential energy we're going to have around. Rain total, which is basically precipitation. Relative humidity is also a variable that comes into play. When we look at some of the methodology that is happening in there, we do have relative humidity as some of those variables are actually explaining. Now, something very interesting, MK, which is that convection variable that was there present to produce the lightning forecasting, is not very useful to explain if a fire is going to start or not. So again, it's not only useful to just know where the lightning is going to start, some of these variables that actually explain lightning do not actually directly explain fire. So that's why we need to model them as different processes. So, question 3 findings. First of all, fire ignition probabilities are controlled by these nonlinear relationships that we can actually see through the modeling framework. Ignition is going to require additional variables related to elevation, fuels, related to many other variables that actually allows us to understand how these ignitions are happening. But they're not directly related to lightning. Very clear, very important to know. And while these variables are very similar, as you saw in some of these plots, they're actually very, very close together in terms of boreal and tundra. So there are not many differences when we look at these ignition side of things between boreal and tundra. We can actually model some of these, understand some of these variables directly from those. Okay, so let's talk about some conclusions. Let's wrap this up. We had an overarching question. what meteorological environmental conditions are governing fault-tolerant lightning and ignition. By now, we're very clear. We have differences that are happening between boreal and tundra. When we look at, can we actually model, or to what extent can we model fault-tolerant lightning? We can model. We can actually model it in a very high resolution. Can we understand some of those drivers through this work? Yes, we can actually understand those drivers. We can actually find thresholds of some of those drivers for lightning. Can we actually understand what are those meteorological environmental conditions that are driving fire ignition? Yes, and we can actually differentiate that what is lightning as well. So we have many findings in here that are very useful for the science community, but that can also explain many of the operational side of things as well. So coming back to the key takeaways, take them home. First of all, lightning, more predictable than we thought. Game changer. We're moving state of the art to now 5 km spatial resolution 10 days in advance. Imagine knowing where a lightning strike is going to happen 10 days in advance. Just think about how useful this would be to even know where to just not stand. Like, just start with that. Lightning and ignition controls strongly biome dependent. We have available energy in the boreal versus the initial controls that are going to start this lightning in the tundra. Last but not least, more lightning does not necessarily translate into more ignitions. You saw that some of these conditions are very different between what ignition is going to be and what lightning is going to be. So ignition probability as the main driver, lightning probability as the main driver for ignition, methodology similar across biomes, views it. Is this work making the world a better place? The answer is yes. Note how damaging, how cruel this scene looks just after a fire. But look how beautiful it is after the fire is actually recovered. Like, we have many people that are doing research in this area that are just trying to understand what is happening with this fire. How can we make sure that we understand some of these drivers so we can actually make the world a better place? We need fires. Fires reconstruct area. They're not always damaging. We have some benefits from them. But understanding them, where they're going to be, we can actually use all the resources that we have in a better and much safer way, which also save firefighters' lives and save the community lives as well. Future directions, there's a lot of work to be done. Like, we have lightning, we have ignition, we have work that already been modeling and forecasting spread. That's kind of the next step. Once you have an ignition, how big is that fire going to get? So we're getting it. One of the things that I've been kind of working on as well is, once we have all these outputs that us geospatial people are going to understand, how can we use then agents to give that information to our stakeholders, to people that are actually interested in, okay, is there going to be a fire here today? What resources do I need to move here? What is the reliability of some of these forecasts? So this is very important work that is happening. We're going to be working on this and trying to push it forward. So here we go. This is the slide that everyone was expecting. Many of you know, I am never in pictures. So getting the slides together was really hard. If you're not here, I'm sorry. Maybe you have a picture of me that I don't have. So I'm just gonna start showing. This is how it started back in like 2013 or something. Little babe. This, maybe you guys know him. So John Jason, you guys might actually know it. That's the guy that actually reviewed my resume as first starting to actually come here. So we have George actually around. This is how I kind of started moving. This is how the transition has been to the day that we have now. So I have been, man, just a brother of many people. That's my I have one. And she to have so many friends. Like, it's just has been beautiful, has been just, I mean, just a good time. So I thank you all for that. It's just beautiful. So I really appreciate you all. I was like, I hate this slide, but I love it as well. I promised someone that I was gonna put this in here. He was my best fan. Like, I'll go to PR and he'll be like, hey, so when are you gonna finish your PhD? I don't know, Grandpa. But how are you modeling lightning? Like, why? Like, what is happening there? Like, why would you even be trying to do that? I was like, Grandpa, like, we need to understand. Like, we don't know it. But how am I seeing that there and you're modeling with computers? Like, how does those computers even work? So I dedicate this to him because Yeah, he was my best fan, and yeah, like it's been an awesome journey. So thank you all for everything. And that's it. Now we're rest.